So thank you for staying for this late afternoon session, which will be fascinating. And to introduce Tweed Roosevelt, I'd like to introduce Assistant Professor John Stout, Assistant Professor of History here at Hofstra, and also on the Board of Advisors of the Theodore Roosevelt Association.
Thank you, Neil. Professor Tweed Roosevelt is the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, which is also known as the TRA. He has served as trustee, a member of the executive committee, and a past president of the TRA for over a quarter of a century. The Theodore Roosevelt Association is a historical and public service organization established in 1919 and is dedicated to perpetuating the memory and ideals of Theodore Roosevelt. Through its many programs, the association promotes scholarship and has been instrumental in the establishment and preservation of historic sites, inspires public service, brings comfort to sick children in hospitals, and develops tomorrow's leaders, from high school students to college students to military personnel to law enforcement officers. After graduation from Harvard, Professor Roosevelt subsequently earned his MBA and taught at Columbia University for 2 years. His long career in management and finance culminated in his becoming chairman of Roosevelt China Investments, which, among other businesses, owns and operates the House of Roosevelt on the Shanghai Bund. Sounds very impressive, Tweed. Over the years, Professor Roosevelt has done much to further the memory and ideals of Theodore Roosevelt. He has lectured and taught about TR at numerous institutions and schools around the world, including Harvard, Marshall, and Santa Clara universities. He has also lectured on a wide range of other subjects, including conservation and the environment, hunting, politics, literature, history, mathematics, Japanese-American relations, and explorations. Also, Tweed, sounds very impressive. He has also traced many of TR's adventures in the American West, Africa, and has led an expedition canoeing down the Rio Roosevelt in the Amazon to document his great-grandfather's earlier explorations in 1914. That was last week, by the way. He has also appeared on numerous television documentaries and radio programs and was awarded the prestigious Telly Award for his public service announcements. Professor Roosevelt currently holds a university professorship at C.W. Post campus of Long Island University and has 2 children and lives in Boston and also on Martha's Vineyard. The title of Professor Roosevelt's presentation today is Ruckus, New Amsterdam, and the Rise of the Roosevelt Family. Without further ado, would you please welcome Professor Tweed Roosevelt. Thank
you. Thank you, John. I would have preferred an introduction that said this man needs no introduction. How could I live up to that? Oh, my God, I don't believe you're talking about me. It's also, by the way, the first time on a public stage I've been referred to, pretty much the first time, as Professor Roosevelt. It's a new title for me. This is a difficult position I find myself in, because being the kind of the cleanup batter here, and I guess some Dutch here probably don't know what a cleanup batter is, but anyway, it's a baseball term for the guy that comes in last and tries to save the situation. And everybody along the way, we have some very erudite people who are extremely knowledgeable about New Amsterdam. And as you might guess from my introduction here, I'm a very broad but rather shallow guy in all these different areas. I'm by no means an expert on New Amsterdam, although I could claim to be, I guess, on the Roosevelts. But we've had, we've covered a lot of territory, but a lot of it has been kind of, as far as my talk is concerned, kind of, sporadic in different particular areas. And so I'll try to pull together some of that here. But for you, particularly this last panel, are you still here? I would appreciate it if you'd leave the room so that you won't second guess some of the things I have to say here. I'm sure I'll be saying some things they'll disagree with. I'm something of an iconoclast, so this is going to be a different kind of talk about the New Amsterdam, and not nearly as sort of laudatory, particularly the early settlement there, as what a lot of people in New York and the New York area and the old Holland area like to believe. I did a version of this talk once to something called the Holland Society of New York, which is made up, it was all male, I think it still is all male, of direct descendants of people, of these people. And I was going to give them this speech, which doesn't sort of portray these people in the best possible light. And I knew there were 600 of them. I was vastly outnumbered. And I knew there was a real problem that, they might not like to hear what I had to say about their ancestors, which was quite different than sort of the sanitized version. Now, the way I got out of there alive was I told the 600 people that I had prepared two versions of the speech. One was the mythological one of how great everybody was, and the other one was, the truth. And I'd let them choose, so I asked for a vote, and anybody who wanted to do the mythological one put up their hand. Unfortunately, nobody did. And then how many wanted to hear the other one? They all put up their hands. I said, well, then don't blame me for what you're about to hear. And I escaped alive. Well, I'm going to divide this speech into three parts, or this talk into three parts. The first, I want to set the stage for New Amsterdam. You've heard pieces of that and indications of it from particularly this last panel, but I want to say it in a more blunt way about New Amsterdam. And the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about to the actual early part up through the 1640s or so of New Amsterdam, and I'm going to use two Dutch dominees, ministers, as kind of the mechanism for doing that. I'll talk about their experiences. And the idea is, but you can't possibly be complete about this, so the idea is that you can draw some conclusions from the behaviors that they behave, the way they behaved, to the whole colony. And it'll be a fairly accurate, I think, portrayal. And then, as promised, I'll talk about the rise of the Roosevelts, i.e. mostly about the first Roosevelt who arrived, and some of the conundrums there, and my own particular theory, which I am announcing here for the first time, about him and his origins and so on, which is quite different than the rest, and I'll get into more of that later. So I want to start out with sort of the story of the Dutch Empire and the Dutch golden years during the sort of late 1500s, early 1600s, which was the time that New Amsterdam was involved. It was created and rose. And it's important to get something of an idea of what that empire was like. And it was an empire. First of all, we've heard various times about the development in Amsterdam and in Holland of the beginning of this whole trading operation, and therefore their colonization. And I think we've heard a little bit about, or you could draw some conclusions about why the Dutch did this. They were the first really major international operation, particularly from a business point of view. This is before the British Empire, before the British became important. Keep looking at you, hoping you'll nod at these things. I'm talking about our expert in the back of the room. And it kind of grew out of the fact of location. And Russell talked a bit about this, about water and the whole relationship with water. The Dutch were forced onto the sea because there they were. And so they built basically a tremendous knowledge and capability about sailing in the sea and fishing and being involved and essentially trading. And of course, it started in the Baltic. But this gave them the necessity to create a navy to protect their ships, and that was mentioned earlier too, but they began to create the navy. Well, this began to put them into a position about thinking about dealing with the rest of the world as traders. The Dutch at heart are business people, always have been. Roosevelts in this country, in spite of the fact of a couple of fairly successful politicians, have always been business people. And it's in the Dutch genes, I think. And so trading is what attracted them to this and what started this explosion. Uh, it was mentioned earlier a little bit about this idea of privatization of the two great trading companies I'll talk a little bit about as far as it relates here, the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West Indies India Company. Privatization might give you the wrong impression. Nothing was privatized. I mean, privatization, at least to me, means something that was public before becomes private. They built this up from scratch, and actually it was quite common then, and still even into the 20th century, of having these private companies given charters to take over the role, and to that extent it is privatization, taken over the role of doing their trading and then the ancillary things that came as a result of that. So the world was kind of cut up by various different people at various different stages who were all going through this trading kind of thing. Sometimes it was done by government, and sometimes it was done by private companies established by the government, and sometimes it was both. So in England, for example, the English, whatever they called their India operation, can't remember, what was they call that? But you know, the company that ran India, they had a private army, they had everything. They were a private company running India up through the Raj. Belgium did this even more privately, in that the king had the Congo as his own personal piece of property, so to speak. So it wasn't sort of that unusual either. We were looking around the world of, you know, with the stage of development of countries, of how they would handle this sort of situation. And so the Dutch clearly went in for private companies, and they decided to divide the world in two. And incidentally, this happened later when the Portuguese, and actually it may have been earlier, the Portuguese and the Spanish were arguing over where they would go, and they went to the Pope, and the Pope drew a line. Said west of that line, it's Spain, and east of that line, it's Portugal. Well, essentially the same thing was done here. The first one to be created was the Dutch East India Company, VOC, as it's known in Dutch. I won't attempt to pronounce the Dutch name. And at first, they were given the entire world. And they became very successful. Some of this was mentioned before, as a business. Private people invested in it, as well did other things, but much of the money came from private investments. The Dutch East India Company was the first listed company in the world. In Holland and Amsterdam, so in Amsterdam, they had the first stock trading company, and the East India Company created, more or less, the idea of bonds and stocks, and they were traded, and people gave money, and so on. And they got going. They had to get capital. That's where they got capital. They got some help from the government as well. And they started in their ventures. And they faced some problems because other countries had already gotten into this business in various ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So they had to kind of find the later pickings. They were late into it. But in those days, you know, if you got an explorer to go somewhere, you could claim it. And then the people had, the country sort of said, that was mine. Well, you know, they had to defend it against other people, and there was a lot of trading going back and forth. And quickly it was discovered that if you wanted to hold an area for business reasons, you had to have and then the number they came up, sort of legal fiction numbers, you had to have 50 colonists to have a foothold. And that came to play a role in New Amsterdam, too. That's why you heard the number 50 several times mentioned. There was a specific reason for that. It's because international law sort of said that was the way it should go. Well, anyway, the Dutch East India Company was magnificently successful. And the success came primarily, at least early on, from the Far East. And they established business operations all around the world. You know, the spices from Indonesia, silk and other, you know, porcelain from Japan, India, many products. In the Caribbean, salt and sugars that went on. So they had this huge network. And it was truly the first world conglomerate where people were all over the world, lots of Dutch, but lots of other people were involved in this. These were all employees of the company. This was a huge conglomerate. And we think this is early 1600s. That's pretty impressive. So they started on, and they were making money hand over fist. And for some reason, it's not entirely clear to me, maybe it was just too big a reach, they decided to split the world and create the Dutch West Indian Company. So the Dutch West Indian Company was given the franchise of the Atlantic, both sides, and for some reason, New Guinea, which as far as I can tell, never produced anything. In other words, you could see fairly quickly that they got kind of the leftovers. And compared to the spice trade, for example, there was a time early on when peppercorns were sold by weighing them against gold. So if you wanted a pound of pepper, you got to put down a pound of gold. Now, this was later, it was cheaper, but it was tremendously productive. And all it involved was going to the Spice Islands, picking up for whatever the equivalent of wampum was there, bringing it back and selling it all around. Tremendously successful. So now they created the Dutch West India Company, and they started looking for capital. And they had a heck of a time finding any capital, because if anybody had any loose capital lying around, you had your choice. This untested sort of second-class citizen, younger brother, or the big money maker. And so they had a very hard time to raise money. And it took them a long time. I forget, I'm not good with dates, but it was like 23 or something before they actually got enough money to get going. And it was a disaster right from the beginning, all the way to the end. I mean, this, compared to the East, this was a complete disaster. They had a really lucky break, and this was mentioned earlier, when early on, when they were sort of not really colonizing anything yet and not really doing much of any trading, their first venture was piracy. And they became a bunch of pirates, and they tried to raid the rich Portuguese and Spanish trade, and they captured the silver. You know, every year, the Spanish, and the Portuguese too, the Spanish would send their product of silver from South America. Now, you got to keep in mind, in South America was the big silver mines. And they basically, what happened is the Spanish discovered an entire mountain made out of silver. I'm not lying here, it's true. This was all silver. And so it was a tremendous source of wealth. And it had all kind of, I'm also a finance guy, but I won't go into all the ramifications of this, but they would send a fleet or two every year called the Silver Fleet, which was filled, a number of boats, ships, with cargoes of silver. And some lucky West Indies company guy and his pirates captured it. And they suddenly got this enormous, and one of you mentioned this earlier, this enormous pile of silver for almost nothing. And so the stock payoff that year was something like 70%. And everybody was somewhat sort of happy about this. They thought this was great, but of course it wasn't replicable. And it did produce some investment, but it didn't, you know, people who, far-sighted people said, well, okay, fine, but you're not going to get that again. What are you going to do? So they began creating their places. And they had a sort of couple of different kinds of approaches. So we'll start on the sugar trade. And the sugar trade, sugar could only be produced by sugarcane in the tropics, and it was horribly labor intensive. And but everybody had a sweet tooth, so you could sell sugar for a lot of money. It was a good trade item, and it looked like a good possibility for the West India Company. Problem was that most of the islands had been taken up by other people, so they could find a few little ones there. But what they did find, that although the Portuguese had been given all of eastern Brazil, including all the coast, the Portuguese hadn't managed to settle it much. So the Dutch came and settled the north coast of Portugal, of Brazil, with their people, and just basically took it over. but they were interlopers. This wasn't theirs. The Pope was, they didn't care about the Pope, but the Pope had, divided up the line, and they were interlopers. But it was tremendously successful, and they sent, as it was mentioned, lots of people there. As we will see, they didn't send anybody to New Amsterdam to speak of. They sent lots of people, and they really got it going, and they were doing well. But they had to have laborers. And the natives in Brazil didn't, and in the Caribbean, I might add, couldn't do it. So that started the slave trade, basically, at least the last leg of the slave trade. The early one was Arabs. And so they had, by kind of force, had to get into the slave trade. And West Africa, and that whole sort of western part of Africa, was not divided up nearly as much as the Caribbean was. And so the Dutch were able to get some really strong footholds. Dutch don't like to talk about this, and neither do we, but it was a big deal for them. And that was a very successful business. So they were bringing slaves over. They were doing the triangle trade and all that, mostly in Brazil. But they did have islands in the Caribbean. And the thing about Caribbean islands, it's fascinating. If you go and visit the Caribbean islands, as I'm sure you all have, whichever island you go to, you quickly come to realize that it had been under a huge number of flags. Each of these islands, sometimes they were Dutch, sometimes they were French, sometimes they were this, sometimes they were that. They kept bouncing back and forth. It was a very unstable kind of place. And you had these little islands, not much protection. Maritime people could take an island over. So if you built an infrastructure, the Dutch, understood investment. If you made investment, and then suddenly, the Spanish took it over, you had to start all over again. So it was a real problem. But in any case, they were quite successful at it for a long time. This is what drove the West India Company. New Amsterdam was nothing. What was in New Amsterdam? So several things you think of. What was there actually? Well, we've talked about furs. There was some wood. There were a few other items, that had some trade value. The Dutch are very clever, so they figured out how to make something of the fur trade. We think of the fur trade as tremendously profitable. It was not. It was partially profitable, and for a while, the Dutch came up, or somebody came up, they figured out you could make beaver hats, and, out of the felt that was mentioned earlier from the short hairs of beaver. And that became a fad in England and elsewhere, but it's a fad. Fads never last very long. It was waterproof. That's why it was a good deal. Silk was waterproof, so it had some function. But this is one thing. It's not much. And then they figured out about what they call the Muscovy trade, and they sent it all. They sent all these furs to Moscow and wherever they sent trade them. But think about it for a minute. There's a place called Siberia. It's full of beavers. So you're trying to sell beavers to people who already have a lot of beavers. But they made some money out of it. But this was not the Spice Islands or even the sugar trade, which, by the way, the demise of the sugar trade was because so many people got into it. It's just like the other things. So there wasn't much here in New Amsterdam to attract people. So they had a terrible time, and you heard about how they tried various different ways with platoon ships and this and that to try to make the Dutch trade work. It wasn't getting anywhere, really. In any sort of the big scale. The Dutch West India Company continued to be a financial embarrassment. And they'd get a few people to come over here, but they were struggling, and I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. But it was not a particularly successful place. The greatness of New Amsterdam, now New York, came later when the United States began to develop as a huge powerhouse, middle thing, but that was all far too late as far as the Dutch are concerned. It didn't surprise me that the Dutch didn't get particularly upset about losing New Amsterdam because there wasn't, as I say, a big deal there. So that sets the stage, and we kind of like to glorify our ancestors, but basically it was a different kind of place. So that's the first step. Second, well, let's see. Let's start I'll start with the Dutch dominees. I'm describing the early colonization here, if you can call it colonization. It has been said before, it wasn't colonization. They came here with the idea of making money and going home. And a few people came, but, and they shipped over a bunch of farmers at different times. But this was kind of like San Francisco in the gold rush. The farmers would get here and they say, to hell with farming, I'm going to do trading. And, the farming never early on grew into much. People had to eat, so there was a certain amount of that, but it wasn't a huge part. The part here was thought to be trading, even though it never was particularly strong. So people started coming, and I'm going to frame this about telling you the story of two dominees, ministers who came. Now, the ministers tended to be the most educated, and this was true in not just Dutch, but elsewhere. Ministers always went, or priests or whatever, and they were better educated, supposedly better educated, sort of more knowledgeable than the rest of the settlers. So the first Dutch minister to come here, dominee, was a guy named Johannes Michaelanius. The Dutch seem to like to Latinize their ministers' names for some reason. And he was about 44 years old, so he was older. Most people came were much younger. And he had 3 daughters, and he was well educated, having completed several years at the University of Leiden, and experienced because he'd served in churches both in Holland and overseas, interestingly enough, in Africa and South America, just the areas we were talking about. So after a truly horrendous crossing in a ship, captained by an irreverent drunkard, and we'll run into a number of irreverent drungles, arrived in New Amsterdam on January 24th, 1628. And what he saw before him on that cold winter morning must have filled him with great misgivings. The little colony had been in existence for about a half dozen years, and yet it consisted of only a few public buildings, a number of rude houses, and about 200 people, all of whom were employed, of course, by the West Indian Company, but who were not perhaps of the best sort. The company was interested in profits, not colonization, as we've said. And furthermore, this was not the place to go, and therefore few people wanted to leave Holland and come here to this what was really a most insignificant and unprofitable place. People who did come to New Amsterdam during these early days, many of them weren't Dutch, were described by this minister, Michaelanius, in a letter written shortly after he arrived as, quote, for the most part, quite rough and dissolute people, unquote. You can imagine how the descendants of these felt when I was saying things like that. He didn't have much nice to say about the local people, the Indians. He called them stupid as garden poles, which seemed to me an interesting thing to say. And as for the blacks, of course, they were slaves here, and a fair number of that tiny group were black, thievish, lazy, and useless trash. Now, this guy, one hopes he kept these thoughts to himself, but this guy was not promising to be, the most warm and fuzzy fellow with his new community. Anyway, for their part, the flock that he was now taking over had gotten along pretty well for several years without a dominee. And the West Indies Company had, before they sent dominees, had somebody, they had this role, they called it comforter of the sick. So this was not a minister, but it was a guy who was supposed to, help out. Boy, Lord knows the sick needed comforters in those days when they bled you and medicine was more likely to kill you than save you. Anyway, one of the applicants for this comforter of the sick was a guy named Sebastian Kroll. And when the committee passed over him at first, you'll see this is a continuing trend, because A, he was illiterate, and secondly, he was a silk worker. And nobody could quite figure out why a silk worker would have anything able to do this. There wasn't any relevance. However, there weren't any other applicants. And so, actually, that's wrong. There was another applicant, but he got sick and couldn't come. I think he got sick is because he found out where he was going to be sent, and he didn't want to go. Sort of the way when I was in grade school, exam time, I seemed to get sick all the time. So they appointed Kroll, and his duties included, of course, performing baptisms and marriages and delivering sermons, which he was to read from a book. Well, the problem was that he was illiterate. He couldn't read. I would love to know what his sermons were like. Incidentally, he wasn't without talent because, and this relates to the fact that there was social mobility in Amsterdam and the colonies as well, because at one point they needed an interim governor, and you'll see why as we go on here. And he was appointed, so he wasn't, all bad. His greatest contribution, however, was named after him, the crawler. Do you know that? Another Dutch thing, the breakfast crawler. Yeah, named after him. So anyway, Miscellaneous had arrived. There were no churches. There was no church. The company had run out of money after they built a warehouse and a windmill and a fort, sort of. And the West Indian Company was always running out of money all the time. However, Miscellaneous managed to persuade a guy who was building a mill, second floor of the room. It was a kind of a horse mill, a horse would grind things, mill that he was constructing, to build a second floor that would be the meeting hall, church, and everything. The mill, incidentally, was used for extraordinary dual purposes. It first ground tree bark, into tannin. You know what tannin tastes like. It's like you taste a pine tree. It's absolutely edible. So half the time it was grinding bark into tannin, and the other half it was turning wheat into flour. They must have had brown flour then. I don't know. I can imagine what that tastes like. However, the main difficulty confronting Michaelmas was Peter Minuit, the governor. He was the guy who his greatest claim to fame was that famous $24 purchase of Manhattan. The thing to keep in mind about that, everybody says, what a great purchase. Well, the Indians that sold it to him were the Canarsie Indians who lived way out on the end of Long Island and had nothing to do with this place. So he bought it from people who didn't own it. And second, calculation, which I did, but other people have done, if you take that $24 and at present value, grow it over the years, it's worth more money than Manhattan is worth today, the entire real estate of Manhattan. So if he took those $24 and stuck them in a bank, he'd own all over the place. Anyway, if the Indians did that, but they didn't. Well, Nicholas arrived. When he arrived, Minuit was in the midst of a gigantic row with his secretary. And as we will see as we go along, rows between people of these 200 people were continuous and vicious, sort of. So the new domine, throwing cautions to the wind, decided to side with the secretary. So we got the secretary and the minister against the governor, and everybody's carrying on. If it wasn't enough, Michaelmas, he began blasting his own congregation with what he described as fiery and punishing sermons. I can imagine what they were like. This guy was not making friends anywhere. And eventually his incessant rantings at his congregation drove them all away. Meanwhile, he was further alienating Minuit by excoriating him from the pulpit. It's telling what a terrible governor it is. One wonders what tact. This guy didn't have any tact at all. And the results were predictable. So a barrage of letters descended upon the West India Company, and eventually they fired both men. So both the minister and the governor were fired. And that wasn't the end of their punishment. So they were all sent back with the secretary, who was the same, the same guy who was fighting her. All these three were sent back to Holland on the same little boat. And when we talk about little boats, these boats were tiny. They were like 50 feet or something. And the trip took forever. But fortunately, this was a fairly quick trip. So in 1633, on the next boat out, by the way, the next boat coming out was named, unbelievably, the Salt Mine. It brought the new governor and the new domine. So this was Governor Wotan Van Twiller. Now, he had previously been employed as a clerk in one of the company warehouses. They're looking for the governor, so where do they go? They get a clerk out of the warehouses. One would have thought that was a rather meager post that wouldn't really qualify him for the job, and one would be right. What did qualify him for the job is that he had an uncle who was one of the board directors. But anyway, they sort of thought of bringing him. Now, the new domine, who is Vardius, I guess, Bogardus, again, Latinizing the names, he appeared, at least on paper, to be much more qualified. Like his predecessor, he was well-educated, University of Leiden, and had served several posts abroad and at home. So Van Twiller's initial act upon arriving here in New Amsterdam was to build a brewery. Probably a pretty good idea because he was a guy who liked his drink, as everybody else did there. But his administrative shortcomings became evident almost immediately. And the inhabitants noted his hesitant decision-making and in resolution in emergencies and called him Woter the Wavier. He might also have been considered somewhat unprepossessing. Now, I know this isn't a good source at all, but Washington Irving described him as 5'6" in height and 6'5" in diameter. So, yeah, Bogardus had his faults too. He was described as a bachelor. I'm confused because sometimes he was a bachelor and sometimes he had a wife, so he may have married somebody here. A bachelor with no fear of the bottle. He built his house conveniently right next to a brewery. I don't know if it was the same one or not. And he too was not known for his tact. So the two men fell out almost immediately. For example, one evening when both men, not surprisingly, had been drinking, Van Twiller chased Bogardus through the muddy streets, brandishing a drawn sword. This doesn't bode well for the two leading men of the area. The domine's response was an equally spirited, but really more on paper. In a letter, he described the director as, quote, a child of the devil, an incarnate villain, and proceeded to give him next Sunday, quote, such a shellacking from the pulpit that it would break his collarbone. Things weren't going too well. In spite of this, the governor built a church, albeit a modest wooden one. So 5 years of this went on before Van Twiller retired from the field in disgrace. He was probably the worst governor, certainly of the period and maybe ever. Even his company director abandoned him in disgust, writing, this remembers his uncle, writing that he was, quote, hot-headed and proud, always inebriated, if there was any wine, lazy, disrespectful, and prejudiced. Excuse me. So now he sailed away, and Bogardus is in sole possession of the battlefield. Well, the next guy to arrive as governor was William Keefe, who we've heard a little about. That was March 28, 38. It's unclear why he was chosen for this job, just like the last guy. His only qualification seemed to be that he had declared bankruptcy. Thus, he was a financial failure, and before he arrived, and an administrative failure shortly thereafter. Keefe's appointment was fortunate for the memory of Van Twiller, as there was now a governor whose behavior was so outrageous that his previous guy was kind of forgiven. New Amsterdam, which welcomed Keefe, was, if anything, even wilder than it had been 5 years earlier. It became a sort of Gomorrah on the Hudson, with one out of 5 buildings being a tavern. And Keefe, who shared his predecessor's weakness for drink, must have felt his luck had finally changed. He was awash in beer here. I won't go into all his administration idiocies, but I'll assure you they were breathtaking in their magnitude. But rather we'll focus on his relationship with Bogardus. First, they got along quite well. The story is told of the two of them rowing across the Hudson to visit a friend in what's now New Jersey, and spending all day drinking. And in the evening, just as the sun was going down, they got into their little rowboat to row back, and their host decided to send him on away, and he had one of these little small cannons. He fired off the cannon, fortunately not hitting the boat, but some wadding blew back on his roof, which was thatch, and his home burned to the ground. These kinds of incidences were fairly common in this crowd. So the first proper church was built, and it came about in rather an extraordinary fashion. Keefe was drinking, as usual, one night with a captain, sea captain named David DeVries. And David DeVries said, it's a disgrace that we only have a wooden church. Let's build something more substantial. And Keefe said, that's a great idea, and you'll put the first 100 guilders in. That you should keep your mouth shut, it says sometimes. But anyway, the captain was no slouch, so he said back, he says, okay, I'll do that. But you've got to set the example by putting in the first 100 guilders. So it happened that the next day, Bogardus's daughter, stepdaughter, was marrying, and all the local people, who's marrying a local doctor, all the local people came to the wedding. And so Keefe, who had some canniness to him, waited until they all got completely plastered, and then brought up the issue of funding for the church. And he got all these people to make pledges in alcohol-fumed euphoria. But Keefe remembered all the pledges, and the next day he held them all to it. So that was the first church. The church was commissioned for 2,500 guilders, although beginning a municipal trend in New York that continues today, its final costs went from 2,500 guilders to 8,000 guilders. Even Boss Tweed would have been proud. No relation. Actually, who knows? So it wasn't long before Keefe and Bogardus began to feud. Again, we don't have to go into details. Bogardus took to excoriating Keefe from the pulpit when Keefe was in the room, in the church, at this new church that had been built. So once it got too much for Keefe, and Keefe left, stormed out. But things continued on. Bogardus continued giving these sermons about how bad Keefe was. So Keefe's response to this was to get the little militia. We heard a little about their tiny militia, which had couple of little artillery items, to park right outside of the church on Sunday and march up and down, making as much noise, beating drums and everything, and firing off cannons to try to drown out. But you can see the level of sophomoric approach that's going on here. Well, the feud went on for several years until the inevitable happened. The West Indies Company fired them both. And once again, Keefe, who it's rumored had made 40,000 guilders there, was taking it back with him, and Bogardus and a number of other vocal dissenters all boarded the same boat for home. So there they all are again, sitting on the boat. And apparently the raucous continued, and so much so that the captain was completely distracted in his navigational duties and managed to put the boat on a famous reef in the channel called the Mumbles, and it's right off the coast of England, and everybody drowned. Peace at last, Bogardus and everybody. So the next guy came along was Becarius, and the whole situation changed. We began, he had a bad start to begin with. The company had initially rejected him, commenting that they did not plan, quote, to take any more idiots as ministers in their service. But you guessed it, no other applicants, and so yet another idiot came. But he rose above his initial shortcomings, and he was lucky to have new governors, and that's kind of the story of the early part of the Dutch in New Amsterdam. I escaped alive when I told this to the other people, and I hope I'll do that too here. So now the third part, which I have some notes here somewhere. And this is about the Roosevelts and New Amsterdam. What do we know? The first Roosevelt came under the name of Klaus or Nicholas von, which just didn't mean anything, royal or anything. Roosevelt. Roosevelt was spelled in all different kinds of ways in all the documents at the time, but he came. So we know they were in New Amsterdam by 1648 because there's the first kind of court record of anything. And thereafter, they appear very occasionally in court records. I'm not talking about, they were very minor things. They weren't generally suits. They were this or that. They were various town records. A perfectly upstanding guy, didn't get into any particular trouble. We also know that they owned 48 acres of land, farmland. They were farmers, and they farmed it, and it was a chunk that sort of, excuse me, was roughly 28th Street to 34th Street, something like that, from, say, Broadway almost over to the river. It was beautiful, bucolic land. And, the Dutch, as I said, weren't farmers for the most part, so the land was available, but he must have had some sort of resources to be able to farm it. But there is no record of him purchasing it, as far as I can tell. There's no record of how this happened. He may have even been a squatter, for all we know. But we do know he was farming there. We also know that they died. He was married to a British woman, we think. Her name was, English name was Samuels. And the thought is that she was British, or English anyway, but no idea anything about the background. And we know that they had 3 children, and within a few years, they were both dead. And the children were thrown on the mercy, which was quite good, actually, of taking care of orphan children. And they had an estate that was not inconsequential. It was not, nothing like the grand estates, but they had enough money so that they left enough money so that the kids could be taken care of. And from that rose the Roosevelts. There was 2 generations down. There was Nicholas. He had 2 sons, and he had a son, and those had 2 sons. So the grandchildren, there were 2 brothers that were the progenitors of the 2 branches of the Roosevelt family. So one produced what's known as the Sagamore Hill or Long Island branch, and the other was the Hyde Park branch. Hyde Park, of course, being FDR and TR on Long Island. By the way, they were the same generation, generationally down. I forget what number it was, but they were the same generation, although obviously FDR was much younger. But the 2 branches of the family, and it was a very successful family over the years. Had done very well, prominent, aside from the politics. But I mean, before that, both financially as business people, all kinds of businesses, and all kinds of interesting my ancestor involved there, and philanthropists. So that was the beginning of the family. Now let's go back to Klaus. What we don't know about him. We don't know when he arrived. There is no record of he and his wife, if they were not married later, of having arrived. There are all kinds of stories. Such a prominent family, you can imagine a lot of people have looked into this. And there's a lot of genealogists who looked into it. And they've created kind of a myth. I'll go into that in a minute. Probably in the family, the greatest genealogist of the family was FDR. And he really paid a lot of attention to this. But anyway, we don't know when they arrived. Now, I'm talking about evidence. There's lots of speculation. We don't have any evidence. We don't have any evidence where they came from. It's always been assumed that they came from Holland, but there's no evidence of that. There's no paper trail or anything, unless our fellows back there can come up with it, but I don't know about it. Pretty much everything else, we don't know anything about them. You know, we don't even know if Roosevelt was their real name. You know, in the Old West in the United States, many people went out west for all kinds of reasons. The cowboys, if you will, or Custer's troops, all those people. Often they used assumed names, often. And they were often running from something. They were running, either had committed some crime, or the debts had gotten to them, you know, a whole number of reasons, or they had an inconvenient wife and a new girlfriend. And there were all kinds of reasons that people changed their name and came out. And that's not a new phenomenon, and it's very likely that a place like New Amsterdam was a good place to escape problems back home, wherever back home was. And you would assume a name. There's no record of who they were. Now, there is a place in Holland, in the southern part of Holland, Zeeland, right, called Tolen. That's how I pronounce it. It's not, how do you pronounce it? All right, well, whatever. Which claims to be the ancestral home of the Roosevelt, and there were some Roosevelts there. Roosevelt means rose field. That can't be the only Rose people who've taken the name Rosefield. So, you know, that's what the sort of the historians and the genealogists have said, is the Roosevelt aroused there, and they found some kind of, you know, family crest that they've used and everything, but there is no evidence. There's no evidence at all. And, you know, it's a real sandhill to build this idea that that's where the Roosevelts came from and that's who these people were. If you look at the other side, the fact that there's no record is, you know, is kind of an indication that it would be a good conjecture that it's not, you know, that something else is true. Also, by the way, the fact that he had a new, apparently, young wife, English, also could be a little suspicious. None of this is conclusive. Anyway, I've come up with a conjecture about all this. It has been mentioned that the Dutch had colonies on the east coast of Brazil. They also had colonies in Chile, and they also had various colonies like St. Martin in the Caribbean. And these were going through large amounts of upheaval in the middle 16, which is, we know he had to come sometime in the middle of the 1640s, probably between 1644 and 46 or so would be the best guess, but we don't know. That's just the period when there was tremendous upheaval. And the two most likely candidates, first Chile, which seems a little distant, but anyway, Chile, we had a Dutch, or there was a Dutch faux, you know, illegal colony that was expelled right in that period, that the Spanish threw them out. They had to go somewhere, you know. In Brazil, although the final Brazilian disaster what happened was, here the Dutch were, they didn't belong there. The locals who were Portuguese didn't like them there. And there was a long kind of insurrection, if you will, of the local Portuguese and Indians and mixed people and so on against the Dutch and wanted to throw them out. And that went on for several years and accumulated in, I think it was 1648, you said was the date, I got it here somewhere, when the Dutch were finally thrown out. So there were people streaming out of there all the time. And as briefly mentioned here earlier, those people had to go somewhere. They might go back to Holland. Much more likely they'd go to other Dutch colonies, and there weren't a lot of choices around. You know, there were a few in the Caribbean, but they looked equally insecure. And if you'd just been thrown out of somewhere in the sugar business and all that, you might easily consider New Amsterdam because it was totally different and didn't have at least those problems, had its own problems, but didn't have those problems. And so I think it's far more likely that this guy was named somebody else, was from somewhere else, and was some other person, and came to New Amsterdam from somewhere else, and there is no connection to who they were, and we will never find out until we dig them up and check their DNA, maybe, I don't know. And you can do marvelous things with DNA now. So it's I won't call it a theory, it's just a conjecture that we're Dutch, at least half Dutch, but not the way we thought we were. So that's my talk, and I'm ready for questions. By the way, this could be it in fact is a whole course. I had to sort of reach down here. Anybody want to ask me anything? Yep. Wait, hold on. She's got a microphone for you. I don't want those folks to say anything back there.
We were just talking about DNA in this row when you mentioned that. Is there a Roosevelt Y DNA project?
Not that I know of. I've never done my DNA. Nobody's said anything to me about that. It would be a good idea.
Yeah, because it would be too far back for autosomal, but Y could potentially be a possibility.
Yeah, send me a kit. Anybody else? Boy, I've stunned you into total silence. You got to have something to say. Here we go. Uh-oh, dangerous part of the room. Oh, very dangerous part of the room.
If the past half century or so, there's been there's been a great deal of very careful scholarship on the Dutch period, which has sought in part to dispel myths from the English period, going back to the 17th century when the English and the U.S. inherited a lot of English features, including the English way of looking at the Dutch, who were their mortal enemy, as drunken louts and sort of buffoons who waddled around until the English took over and got things going. If you were to ignore all of this half century or so of scholarship and just read some of those old sources, including Washington Irving, who basically wrote fiction about the period, you would get something like the final presentation today.
That's a high compliment. Thank you.
If I could just make a few points that I noted. The Muscovy Company was not a Dutch company that attempted to sell furs to the Russians. The Muscovy Company was an English company that bought furs from the Russians. The Dutch seem to like Latinizing names. Well, Europeans, before Europe, there was the Roman Empire, and as Europe moved into the Middle Ages, Latinizing your name was a form of showing that you were educated. The attack of the Dutch attack on the Silver Fleet in 1628 was not an act of piracy; it was an act of war. There was a war between the Dutch.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're right about that. Right.
To say that the Dutch were interlopers in the Caribbean would be fair if you were calling the Spanish and the English and the others your interlopers as well.
I agree.
On the locals.
Yeah.
Washington Irving cannot be considered a source.
I also agree. Good for you. You're going to help me out on this.
It's possible to argue the tolerance or intolerance, the extent to which tolerance was a real thing, for example, among the Dutch in the 17th century. It's possible to argue the extent or lack of influence that the Dutch had in New York, in America, elsewhere. But it has to be based on facts. It has to be based on the work of scholars who have been working on it for decades. So I just wanted to get that point across.
Russell, wait a minute. Don't give it up yet. I'm interested about the Muscovy Company. So I got that wrong. Did they trade with the Russians?
Yeah, the Muscovy Company was...
No, the Dutch.
I don't know if the Dutch did. They probably did as well.
They did. They just didn't do it through the Muscovy Company.
The Muscovy Company was an
I'd
English
seen
company,
it said as
so-called-
the Muscovy trade, but not the company. I get it.
So-called because they traded with Russia to get furs from them.
Okay. Great. Thank you. I love it. I can correct things. And I survived this. The other pros want to say anything back there? Okay. Yes, one of the ways I end my Wait, before you speak, one of the ways I end my talks when I'm last, it's like this is, I suddenly realize I'm the only person standing between you and a martini. And that's not a good position. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I am Leslie Peters, and my last name is Peters, spelled Piet, the Dutch spelling. I grew up in New Amsterdam, Guyana, South America.
Yeah.
And my question is, I have two questions. What brought the Roosevelt family up to Herkimer, Jordanville, Central New York? And why did it take so long for, I think finally there's a TR Presidential Library?
Okay, two questions. Yeah, no. No is the answer to the second.
No?
Yeah, I'll get into that for a
Okay.
second. Thank you for that question. By the way, one of my best friends, I didn't get your name. What's your name? Leslie. Leslie, one of my best friends in business school was a Dutch Guianan, I guess, how you pronounce it. Yeah. And so he was a good friend. And that's how I learned that the Dutch were actually there. The reason FDR went up the Hudson was he didn't want to go out in Long Island because that's where his cousin was, and he was trying to do it. No, that's not actually true. It's from, I believe, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe it's because of non-Roosevelt ancestors of his had places. You know, a lot of sort of the rich in New York, they either went to the North Shore of Long Island or they went up the Hudson, and other places too, but those were the two major places. And so the Delanos and others went up the Hudson. As to the presidential libraries are a relatively new phenomenon. I think the first one was Truman. There've been some retroactive ones now. And so there never was a presidential library of TR stuff. So when TR died and shortly thereafter, his papers were distributed to two areas. The governmental papers went to the Library of Congress, which was already had them, basically. And the private papers, more or less, went to Harvard, to the Houghton Library. And so that function had already been taken care of. You know, presidential libraries come about because the president of the time retires and he gives all his paper to something and raises a lot of money to build a library. So you'd have to retrofit this. And, you know, it's very hard to imagine how a presidential library could come into existence because places like Harvard and LC are not going to give up their stuff. So what you're really talking about is a presidential museum. The Theodore Roosevelt Association tried this, and for reasons I will not go into because they're sort of embarrassing, failed. Right now there is an effort in North Dakota, which is where TR spent his Western experience, in a place called Medora in the Badlands, where there is now the only national park named for a person. Of all the 230 or whatever there are of them, the only one is the Theodore Roosevelt National Park in the Badlands in the western part of North Dakota. Problem with North Dakota, it's the least visited state. It's not on the way to anywhere, so almost nobody goes there. But I'll tell you, the Badlands are wonderful. And if you might consider a trip there sometime. You know, let me know if you're interested. But and I spend a fair amount of time. So they're thinking of building a presidential museum. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. When did who? TR? That was early on. He let's see if I can get this right. When his first, he had two wives. When his first wife, Alice, produced Alice Blue Gown Alice, you know, and Alice Longworth, all that, she died, his first wife died in childbirth. That not only that, his mother died on the same day in the same house, and Valentine's Day, you can imagine. So that essentially, he was 24, I think, essentially destroyed him. He went out west. He'd been planning to build Sagamore Hill, but he didn't. And he was going to call it Lee Home. His first wife was the last name was Lee. And so everything came to a stop when she died, and it took him a couple of years, as one might imagine, to recover this. Then he met and married his second wife, and he didn't really, you know, but he'd had the plans, you know, it was very far along. And so he decided to build it anyway. She was okay with it, and that became his home. And that's the only home he really owned.